onto the language of the 18-year-old while trying to unpick the Premier. It's the full spectrum. It keeps you young and makes you feel old. It deprives you of sleep, but brings such deep satisfaction. You commit with every fibre of your being, knowing that one day they'll tip you out. It's the art of coaching with Nathan Buckley. And I imagine there are days when you miss it and days when you're glad that you've left it behind. Hello to you, Bucks.
G'day, Jared. How are you?
Well.
You summarise it very well. It's a thankless task at times, and there's plenty to tell you when you've got it wrong. And in the end, you've got to surround yourself with people that you respect. You've got to enjoy the journey, the ups and downs, and make sure that you celebrate the good times because they don't last.
So we're going to pick through a whole lot of coaching scenarios this morning that are acutely felt and much debated. And I feel like probably right at the front of it is the premiership coach who has endeared himself across the football community across his 2 years in charge. Now they're searching desperately. I heard you say yesterday, so when there's 100 things, you want to focus on 2 or 3. I was so curious. How do you pick the 2 or 3?
It's you only really know if when you're in the environment, and it's a gut feel. You can access as many opinions as you like. You can speak to your match committee. You can go to your leaders. You can look at the evidence statistically. You can look at the video and what you're seeing behind the goals. You might even listen to a little bit of opinion externally. It's hard not to seep in. But then after that, you're going to trust your gut and go back to your philosophy as a coach. And that's what I think you learn as you go along. You've got to go back to what are the base elements of what you believe is your method of coaching, 1, and 2 is how you think the game should be played. So that's what like Craig will be going through right now. And from coaching with him, his coaching philosophy is to coach the strengths, is to find the positive and to reinforce the positive. And it is, as we've seen, it is a lot of reinforcement, positivity, but then that's the edge is we're winners, and this is what winners do. So no losers limp. We don't feel sorry for ourselves. We hold our heads high. We understand that sometimes we're going to fall short, but then we've just got to go and do the work to make sure that when we're around the next time that we can close that gap, bridge that gap, and go over the top, so to speak. So that what we see on Thursday will be instructive, and there's just some games that come around that you just need to find a way for the scoreboard to look the way you want it to at the end of the game, regardless of the process, regardless of what you do, and this is one of those games.
How do you draw that out?
Well, it's a fine line because even though there's an element, and most of the conversation around Collingwood has been that they are not at the level, that they've come off a couple of percent because maybe it's a premiership hangover, so maybe it doesn't mean as much. Maybe they haven't found the energy. I find more often that it's not actually a less than react or a less than mentality that leads to a drop, like what seems like a drop off in effort or a drop off in intensity. It's often going over the top and trying to prove something, and when I see these missed handballs, and I see that the players are in some ways they're overreaching to try and avoid being labelled with the hangover. There's overreaching going on, so maybe it's pulling the anxiety back a little bit. But when you're 0-3 and you need to win, there is anxiety, there is expectation internally and externally. And so that becomes the margins for success or the margins for comfort and for high performance are a lot smaller now than they were for Collingwood for the last couple of years, for instance, in a small cycle. So it is really challenging as a coach to find that, because I don't think you're not going to see the best of Collingwood and you're not going to see the best of Brisbane on Thursday. And I don't think anyone really expects to. I don't think Craig McRae or Chris Fagan expect to see the very best of their Chargers, but they don't need to see the best. They just need to be 1 point better than the opposition on that night.
Yep.
And that would mean a whole lot to either side, and that's why it's compelling viewing, because there's just some games you just need to find a way to get over the top. It doesn't need to be pretty. You just need to get over the top.
Stability is such a treasured commodity in sport right now, but what's the place of a bit of shock therapy as well? Would there be a temptation to make a team change, to make a positional change, or do you resist change? What's the tension piece in whether to go for it or not?
So this is still with Collingwood.
Say with Collingwood.
Yeah, look, you need to have you need to believe that if you're going to make a change, either tactically or personnel, that it is going to result in a better outcome. Like I think you lose a game after 2 years of high performance and being able to top the mountain. You lose a game, you back your players. You lose a second game, you back your players. You lose the third game, you might be thinking, okay, we've made little shifts. We had a couple of 6-day breaks. We've now got a 7-day break. It'll work out, okay, when do I start saying, hey, hit a few guys between the eyes and say, we need this from you. This is the minimum expectation. And you haven't quite been there. Over the 12 quarters of evidence, I reckon you might have been there for 2 or 3, or you might have been there for 4 or 5, and that's not cutting it. We need this from you as a minimum for 4 quarters tonight, or this week. And I think that's probably what's going to take place. So, and the players are sort of asking for that as well. They want to know, okay, well, what am I going to hang my hat on here? What am I going to get rewarded for? What am I going to get valued for? Because you're probably in a bit of a grey area that you haven't been in for a couple of years. So that's the challenge. I don't know I don't know the depth of personnel at Collingwood at the moment. List turnover sort of happens pretty quick. But I dare say that if guys were performing in the VFL, Reef McGuinness was performing, and that change was made last week with Ash Johnson. Finn McRae's come up after a really good 18-month block as a VFL in the VFL, and whether he is ready to take that step to the AFL. There's a big difference. There's a big gap between those two leagues. Kruger's injured, McStay's injured, so there's the question mark is there's no Adams, Mills, and Parker like for Sydney. I don't know. It's probably closer to Atkins and Bruin at Geelong. There might be a couple there, but only the coaching staff know that, and they would make the assumption or they'd be working out whether it's time to bring a young player in and whether they're ready to go into this cauldron in a must-win game and get it done. So I think Craig is traditionally a pretty aggressive. He wants to make it happen. He's happy to attack it and go for it. There's a lot of chutzpah in the way that he goes about it. So I wouldn't be surprised if they make some bold calls. But at the same time, the incumbents have done a pretty good job over a long period of time, and they deserve some loyalty. So the balance of that is a tough one, for the selection panel.
Yeah. So I'm curious around, say, dropping a senior premiership player, and I'm not saying that they should, but the foibles have belonged to the senior core primarily. How big a contemplation is it? Even if you thought you wanted to, because a player just wasn't quite physically there or mentally there, can you undermine the group by doing it, or can you invigorate a group by doing it?
Both can happen with the same decision, depending on the outcome. And it might be there might simply be a case of diminishing returns. That doesn't mean your coach any worse. It just means that the commodities that you have available to you are no longer what they were. And we're talking about my club, talking about a playing group that a club that I was intimately invested in for 30 years, that I had the chance to coach for 9.5, players that I have an emotional connection with. And there's people on in the staff that I have a really strong emotional connection with. So I'm biased. But when Brownie mentioned, the turnover of an era, that made sense to me last night. It's not just a premiership hangover potentially. It's more a list that has been fairly consistent and stable for 5 or 6 years. That lost a grand final in 18, lost a prelim in 19, won a final, and then lost a semi in 20. Had a really average year in 21, which caused a turnover. And has endured a list management crisis, salary cap crisis, and had to turn over. Relied really heavily on locker room leadership and been led brilliantly. Scott Pendlebury, still side bottom, Jeremy Howe, Taylor Adams, who's now gone, Brodie Grundy in some way, who's now gone, Adam Treloar in some way, who's now gone, and those three guys they will tip over at some point. Now, whether it's happening now, we don't know, but there is a natural evolution, and there are diminishing returns. Nothing lasts forever. No one plays forever, and that might, regardless of how well you coach or otherwise, the right decisions you make or otherwise, things have their time. So, it's up to Maynard, De Goey, Crisp, Nick Dacos, Josh Dacos, these younger players that are coming through. Darcy Moore as the captain, who's still got 5 or 6 great years in him. It's up to them to work out, are we going to step up even more, and are we capable of it? But to expect them to step into the voids of absolute champions like Sidebottom and Pendlebury, who have done it for 15 years, it's still a tough ask. And Geelong suffered that last year with Selwood stepping out, even with the experience that they had. So there's still a bit to play out. There's a 3-week sample.
Yeah.
I still expect Collingwood to be really good this year. I still expect them to look like a top 4 contender and their best football at times for us to look at it and go, hey, that can go and win the flag this year. But they're going through a challenging period right now.
Do you think a couple of those players might be pondering their football mortality early in the season?
No, I don't think early in the season. No. There's no doubt that's an ever-present possibility. And I dare say that when you get to an age where that you're far closer to the end than you are to the beginning, that playing in a winning team changes the circumstances and your thought process to playing in a team who is potentially on the decline. So that, or a list that is on the decline. So that's part of weighing up what you're going to do for you and what you think you can contribute to the football club. Because a Scott Pendlebury in a team that's in the middle of the ladder is a very different, like in his last year or two, is a very different prospect to a Scott Pendlebury who's in a top 4 team. So that would be part of his decision, it'd be part of Steele's decision, part of Jeremy Howe's, part of anyone who finds themselves in that position. Callum Ward at GWS, like his thought process would be different now that GWS are contending. Then I can hang on for a little bit. I reckon I can contribute a little bit more. I don't need to be eaten a bit, but I can contribute my strengths to this campaign or these campaigns, and I think that does make a difference.
The last one around this scenario is, how acutely aware would the coach be of his demeanour, publicly and privately, this week? So Craig McRae's next press conference, his weekly press conference, is at 11 o'clock today. His hard-on-sleeve demeanour is now drawn, as I say, there's nowhere you can't draw criticism these days, as that's drawn the first level of criticism probably since he came to the job. How Michael Voss spoke last year around keeping a diary, which kept him every day. He would write in his diary before he went in the hard times, before he went in, what sort of coach do I want to be today? And he kept that as his reference point every day, reinforcing every day, what do I want to be, what do I want to be, what do I want to be? And the feedback he got at the end of it was he was to his players exactly what he was striving to be. So he was acutely aware of whatever he needed to go through personally, but his demeanour needed to be spot on when he got to the club. So I'm interested in the public and private for McRae today. Yeah,
well, Dave Whedon was great for me and for many coaches, of my era, I suppose, that went through with him as a mentor of sorts. He was an assistant coach at Collingwood after his Essendon days, and then he worked at the AFL in the coaching pathway. He took Adam Simpson and I across to America. We went to Stanford in 2016. So I've had, and a lot of wisdom there. One of the things that I'll never forget is that he said, you need to have something to fall back on. That's your coaching philosophy. What do you believe in? And then if you, I'll never forget that. And he was really strong in the way that his expectation, how he thought he should coach as a development coach, as an assistant coach, let alone as a senior coach, because you need to have methods and beliefs to fall back on in exactly these times. What are my non-negotiables as a coach? Paul Roos said, if your players don't know what pisses you off, don't know what gets on your goat, well then that's a failure in you to be clear about what your expectations are and your minimum expectations and philosophies as a coach. I have to believe, and I do believe that, because Craig McRae's a great coach, that the players are fundamentally aware of what disappoints him or what's not enough or what the minimum standards are. And I think it's largely around preparation and the work required to give yourself the best chance to succeed. And you can still be doing that. And when he says, I'd be surprised if people do as much. Now, I thought I think that's a fair comment. He's allowed to hold that opinion, but that just goes back to his philosophy. Philosophically, I'm a coach who coaches fundamentals. We do a lot of fundamental work, skill work, ground ball, tackling, aerial, body work, body position. Like, we do all of that. We do a lot of that, and that is a fundamental of my coaching philosophy. So that's what he's already going back to it. And it'll be criticised if it doesn't result in wins. But over the long term, coaching fundamentals is a pretty good start.
The Art of Coaching.